Hello and welcome to the Regrettable Century. It's Chris and Jason again. The other losers aren't here because they're like at their jobs or whatever.
Losing.
Yep. And we're going to touch on a subject that we haven't really touched on very much since the very beginning of the podcast. We did a one specific episode out of our fascism series on National Bolshevism, Strasserism, and third positionism. And since we released that episode, I've gone through, 5 years of schooling in that subject. So I know a little bit more than I did then.
Well, yeah,
so
and also
maybe on that again.
We're also maybe a little bit less interested in the way that people call their opponents on the left, Strasserites and Nazbols. This is more like what are those terms actually about?
Right, we're going to be specifically dealing with Strasserism and National Bolshevism as they occurred in the Weimar Republic.
So, we'll
as
they occurred.
Yeah, as they occurred, right. We'll probably discuss, further iterations of these ideologies. And we're basing this whole conversation on a paper I wrote, which I want to get published. And once I get it published, I'll share it with everybody. But I don't want to share this rough, unfinished paper with everyone. So you're just going to have to take our word for how good it is when we tell you about it.
Yeah, it's really good. It's even better than we say it is.
Wow, that's crazy. Anyway.
The first thing I want to do is I want to just ask if we could just go through the glossary of terms, because I think there's lots of things which I have a sense of, and I'm just going to assume you know more about it than I do because you wrote the paper. But then also the listeners maybe know even less.
Okay, so I included in this paper a glossary of terms because I didn't want to assume my readership was going to have the specialized knowledge of Weimar Germany that I have. So I'll go ahead and start at the top of the list of the glossary, which is corporatism, which I think is the way I hear this word used and have on and off through the entire time I've been a leftist. It's people think corporatism is just where you support big corporations. So basically like the Republicans and the Democrats. No, corporatism is a collectivist political ideology which advocates organizing society in bodies, such as guilds, to represent groups with common interests. For instance, workers, peasants, shopkeepers, the military, and business, etc.
So it's kind of really the opposite of the way that it's sometimes used.
Right. And we talked about this multiple times on the show, that corporatism is specifically a system that is meant to harmonize the classes. It's supposed to be a way to keep excesses in either direction from occurring. So, yeah, it's supposed to give enough to the toiling classes that they're content, and they don't want to have revolutions and take away everything from the ruling classes.
Yeah, a lot of Hegel's philosophy of right, there's a description of kind of a corporatist philosophy.
Well, we're going to get to Fichte later in this paper. So
yeah.
You might see where he gets that from. Okay, so next is the Freikorps, which, if you know anything about German history, you know what the Freikorps is. It's the volunteer paramilitary groups that took part in the post-revolutionary violence of the Weimar Republic, mainly used against communist militias and worker uprisings. And I don't know about mainly. They also fought against encroachment by the Poles in the East, because the Poles were trying to grab as much Polish-speaking territory from the Germans as they possibly could. And they also fought in the Baltics against the Bolsheviks, mostly, but also against the white Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians.
I think they're probably most famous, though, just for killing Rosa Luxemburg.
Right. And for our purposes, that's mainly what we're going to be talking about here. Next is a Gau, spelled G-A-U, which is the medieval German word for territory, and it's used by the Nazis to divide regional associations of the Nazi Party. So there's a Gau of Berlin, and that's the one that Joseph Goebbels was in charge of. And there's the Gau of North Germany, which is the one that Otto Strasser was in charge of. And there's several other ones. Next is the term Kaiserreich, which is the pre-revolutionary German imperial state ruled by the Kaiser.
Yeah, it's not just a game on the internet.
Right. A mod for Hearts of Iron 4. KPD, which is the German Communist Party. Lebensraum, which is the German word for living space, the concept invoked by the Nazis and folkish nationalists for land needed to sustain the German population. Of course, the NSDAP, which is the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. The Putsch, which is the German word for coup d'etat. Soviet, which is the Russian word for council, often used outside of the USSR to refer to a workers' council. The SPD, which is the Social Democratic Party of Germany.
Night of the Long Knives.
It's a purge that took place between June 30th and July 2nd, 1934, where the NSDAP murdered the unstable elements within the party, as well as numerous other political opponents.
It's kind of like the Nazi Yezhovshchina.
Yes, exactly. So, Volk, spelled V-O-L-K, roughly translates to people, but it contains spiritual connotations about the connection between the German people, the land of Germany, and the divine. Like, Volk is a mystical concept, as well as being like a concept that embodies the German people.
So it's maybe more like narod in Russian. When we refer to like narodnichestvo, it's like we translate that as populist, but it's not quite the same thing. It's there's more to it. It's deeper. It's closer to Volk than people.
Right. Now, and we'll go into it a little bit deeper in the paper. And then folkish, which roughly translates to folkish, but refers to the movement of German ethno-nationalists that advocated a spiritual and cultural rebirth. Then, Volksgemeinschaft, which roughly translates to people's community or national or racial community, which is used to express the notion of a people united across class lines to achieve a national purpose. It's really the German folkish utopia, which is the Volksgemeinschaft. And when the Nazis talked about it, it was the racial utopia, and then earlier iterations of folkish nationalists, it was like the German people free of the outside influences of capitalism and liberalism, etc.
Right.
All right, so I start off the paper like in the introduction talking about like the relevance of this topic to modern day. And I talk about how there is a concept of German socialism, which is a very specific type of socialism that is not Marxist. And it's a backwards-looking anti-capitalism that it's corporatist in nature and has elements of folkish nationalism. So, like, in the intro, I talk about how there's a lot of arguments about, was Hitler a socialist? Were the Nazis socialists? And, not by any standard by which we might measure what a socialist is. No, they were not socialists. But by standards that Germans in the early and mid 20th century would have understood as socialist, it gets a little bit more blurry there, right?
Yeah, like in the Communist Manifesto, right? There's like a little sections about all the backward socialisms, the romantic, feudal, all the socialisms which are not scientific.
Right, and there's a section where he refers to the real socialists or German socialists, and that's where you can trace this all the way back to just after 1848.
Yeah, I think at some point I would like to investigate deeper into the thought of Ferdinand Lassalle and Eugene Düring, because I know some bits and pieces, but I kind of feel like there's a much more connective tissue.
Yeah, I think that those sort of bridge the gap between this backwards-looking nationalism, nationalist anti-capitalism, and the SPD, right? Which contained Lassalleans and Marxists, But
prominent ones too. Like I forget his first name, but maybe the most prominent one is a guy whose last name is Weimar, and he's like the SPD, that the parts of the SPD which ally with parts of the Freikorps to get rid of people like Rosa Luxemburg.
Right. So basically, I say it's true that the NSDAP's concept of socialism started out shaky and ill-defined and diminished to little more than an aspiration by the beginning of the Second World War. And it's also true that the NSDAP's vision never resembled anything that we might consider socialism. But, there would have been Germans, lots of Germans, who recognized German socialism as a specific thing, a romantic anti-capitalism that was folkish nationalist in essence. So my argument here is that in this paper is sort of peripherally related to the entire concept of German socialism, where I talk about how it's, it is a type of socialism, but it's got its roots in folkish nationalism and not in Marxism.
So it's not quite as simple as the way that we, when I say we, I don't mean us, but when people of our ilk might say things like, the National Socialism, it's not real, so it's a different thing. I mean, it is a different thing, but it's not like pulling the wool over your eyes. It's recognized as a different thing by the proponents of it.
Right, and you could say, it's not real socialism. Sure, it's not. Right? This is a sort of mass movement of the petty bourgeoisie. Nazism was a mass movement of the petty bourgeoisie to institute something that didn't look anything like what Marx or the majority of socialists at the time would have said was socialist. So sure, it's not real socialism, but it is recognized by the people, like the proponents of it, and of several other stripes of German nationalism to be a type of socialism. So, when
it's like not a trick.
No, it's not a trick. Yeah. That's the main point. There is it's not a trick. No one was trying to pull the wool over anyone's eyes by pretending to be socialist. Though I think maybe Hitler might have been, but the Nazi movement as a whole, being a part of this whole milieu of right-wing nationalist anti-capitalists, were not being disingenuous about their idea of a concept of socialism. Now, Hitler, I think, we'll get to this later, but Hitler, ever the pragmatist, was totally willing to subordinate all other parts of the Nazi Party's program to the concepts of racial purity and conquest of living space in the East.
Right.
So I say that this phenomenon is confusing to those whose idea of a political spectrum is a two-dimensional continuum that moves from right to left along a straight line. So it, obviously reality is more complicated than that concept. And we've talked a lot about what leftism actually is and what rightism actually is recently. And one of the things I said that you have to take into consideration about Germany is that it unifies late. It has the late establishment of a liberal political base, and at the same time that there's industrialization is happening, there's a romantic sort of revolt against industrialization and modernization and the atomizing effect of those things. So all of that together breeds this backwards-looking anti-capitalism that views capitalism, parliamentarism, liberalism as foreign impositions. So it's not just that capitalism is immoral or, benefiting the few at the expense of the many. It's that it's foreign. This is.
There's a somewhat. It's an understandable. It's kind of true. It's not. It's too simplistic to say that, but it's kind of true. When you read some of the older folkish nationalists, they refer to industrialization as Manchesterism. So this is an English thing. This is an English bourgeois thing. It's not it's alien to German culture. I wanted to point something out. I really like this. I don't know if it's going to stay in the the final version of this, but I guess you wrote it a while ago. It says, in an article that appeared in the National Review in July 2015, titled Bernie's Strange Brew of Nationalism and Socialism, conservative columnist Kevin D. Williamson refers to Jewish presidential candidate Bernie Sanders' comparatively tame welfare state liberalism as a type of national socialism. That's in quotes. No doubt attempting to draw connotations that are inevitable when one hears or sees those two words together in a sequence.
Yeah. Well, that's sort of, when I was making the point about this being a relevant topic, I was talking about the debate over who's a fascist and whatever else, the way that liberals sort of paint everyone to their right as fascists, and even the, and right-wingers try to paint socialism as being the same thing as National Socialism.
Yeah. That's one of the many problems with that simple left-right continuum. There's no way to maintain a coherent line of logic as you try to traverse that line.
Right. So this revulsion of bourgeois ideology, capitalism, and democracy was combined with amorphous feelings of folkish collectivism in a messy spectrum-defying collection of ideologies. So, my argument is that a pre-existing notion of German socialism rooted in the romantic idealism of the 19th century made for an intellectual ferment that allowed for the blossoming of competing notions of nationalist socialism. That phenomenon is most clearly illustrated by examining two sometimes overlapping and sometimes opposing camps of German socialists. And the two that I picked are the National Bolsheviks, represented by the writings of Karl Otto Paetel, and the National Socialists of the left-wing variety, often called Strasserists, represented in the writings of Otto Strasser.
Those are like the most significant camps in this milieu anyways, right?
And they're both like minuscule too, but they have a sort of outsized impact beyond their like lifespan. But yeah, so I think another prominent National Bolshevik is Ernst Niekisch. He's probably the one that people know more about. But Ernst Niekisch sort of like was an individual and a writer who published a magazine, and he organized around that magazine. Whereas the Karl Otto Paetel organized a group that tried to win converts within the Communist Party and the Nazis. They're trying to bridge this gap between them and recruit the left wing of the Nazi Party and the right wing of the Communist Party into like a National Bolshevist organization. And that's not what Niekisch did. Niekisch was primarily a publisher. So basically, both of these groups have roots in the romantic anti-capitalism of the 19th century, but they're different in significantly important ways. So the Strasserites represent a commitment to reactionary petty bourgeois corporatist organization of society that predates the Russian Revolution by over 100 years, I think, or about. They predate the Russian Revolution by several years. I don't know how exactly. I don't know exactly when corporatism takes hold as a concept in Germany. I know it comes about in the mid 19th century and as a Catholic method for organizing society in a more fair way. But I don't know when it takes hold in Germany. But it goes back to the middle of the 19th century at the latest.
It's funny because it seems to be roughly corresponding with the Russian revolutionary tradition of a pre-Marxist variety, the philosophy of the Narodniks.
Right. And so the National Bolsheviks, in most respects, are pretty similar to the Strasserites, but they see the salvation of Germany in adopting some Bolshevik aesthetic and organizational principles. But they both come from the same soil of mystical folkish nationalism, romanticism, illiberalism. So what I did was I took two different books. One was the National Bolsheviks Manifesto by Karl Otto Paetel, and the other one was Germany Tomorrow by Otto Strasser. Germany Tomorrow is a book that he wrote before the Nazis came to power, but it wasn't published in its complete form until after World War II began. So before we examine those two, we could give a little history of German socialism. And by the time that the Kaiserreich collapses, Germany had already had a long tradition of intellectual discontent with modernity and liberalism that goes back to the 19th century. And anyone who knows anything about European literature is going to recognize Sturm und Drang as well as the German Romantic movements. Yeah. So for many Germans, the Industrial Revolution was seen as a disruption of an idyllic German way of life. And of course, as I mentioned, it is all viewed as a foreign imposition that was an affront to the idealism and romanticism of the sort of bucolic nature of the German people.
Yeah, like I guess anybody who really likes to read Goethe might kind of get it.
Yeah, so during the Wilhelmine period, like the reign of Kaisers Wilhelm the First and the Second, there was a pretty strong sense of alienation that began to take hold as proletarianization and industrialization did its thing. The same thing is seen everywhere else there's ever been proletarianization and industrialization. It was a major disruption of the way of life of most people. So the prominent German historian Georg Mosse, or George Mosse, describes the beginnings of this ideology of rebirth, which he calls the German ideology, or the Folkish movement. He says that the concept of the folk, and this is what I was saying earlier, and I'm just going to quote what I wrote here, is that the concept of the folk is a spiritually, geographically, and linguistically unified community with a deep collective relationship to one another and the divine. Mosse writes that the folk was seen to be the link of the human soul with its natural surroundings, with the essence of nature, and the substance of the German folk was believed to be drawn from the soil. Its creativity, vitality, and depth of feeling was the result of a collective relationship of the people to the soil, which had been watered with the blood and infused with the essence of Germans for generations in a cycle of reciprocal nourishment. So folkish theorists believed that the landscape that people came from had a defining impact on their national essence. So the example that I used in my paper was, like, Jews were seen as a desert people, so they were a dry and shallow folk that were incapable of profundity, creativity, and were spiritually barren. Whereas Germans, living in their dark, mist-shrouded forests, were seen as deeply mysterious and profound.
So maybe I hate this term, factoid, fun fact, whatever, for trivia purposes. But that's why the German ideology by Marx and Engels is called the German ideology. They said that they say that morality, religion, metaphysics, all the rest of the ideology and their corresponding forms of consciousness, whatever, blah, 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 blah. This basically, it's the assertion of the materialist conception of history, as opposed to what was common to their own audience at the time, where everyone knew this Volkish nationalist socialism as a distinct, separate thing.
Yeah,
like the German idea, it's not the name of the thing that they're adopting. They're saying that's no good, and this is why.
Right. So speaking of the German ideology, let's talk about German idealist philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte, who was such an important influence on Hegel. So Fichte is often referred to as the father of pan-Germanism and is a firm fixture among the intellectual antecedents of German socialism. So Fichte had a plan that he lays out for the German Republic, which had a commitment to a collectivist ethos and the general welfare of the people. So it shows up in the same form in other versions of nationalist socialism. So Fichte starts out as a radical liberal and admirer of the Jacobins, but as he got older, he broke from the radical notions of freedom that he saw as foreign and began to advocate for a strong central state that had the power to create a circumstance that could mold a better type of man. So it's still a type of republicanism, but he just kind of he de-emphasizes freedom and starts envisioning a more powerful state. So
he de-emphasizes like personal liberty in favor of concentrated
collective welfare.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah. So, like, unlike the later Nazis, who Fichte is like often unfairly blamed for inspiring, he was something of a liberal and a Republican. But his republicanism advocated a strong welfare state that saw all property as a fief of the state, parceled out to those who could work it for their own benefit and the good of the collective. So he believed that the
kind of
state
like the way they do in China right now.
Yeah. He believed that the state should own all soil, natural resources, and all means of production, and that it should hold the ultimate right to redistribute wealth and land as the population shifted. So rather than like collective farms, it would be like entails given to the individuals to work them out as as individual families. So he argued for the unification of all German-speaking lands and the expansion of the German state until it filled its natural boundaries, which would provide a living space, Lebensraum, for all its inhabitants.
How much are the natural boundaries, or whatever, how much were the national boundaries defined? Because, like, for the French Republican tradition, there were natural boundaries that were defined as the Rhine and the what are the mountains that separate Spain from France? The Pyrenees.
Those are
and the Alps. They're like
yeah.
There are clear geographic things that those are our natural boundaries.
So for the Germans, it's always been something. There are no solid boundaries because it's anywhere there are German speakers. So parts of Poland, the Baltic states, Austria, parts of the Czech lands, and parts of Hungary, even parts of Romania have a strong German-speaking contingent. Then there's the Swiss, parts of most of Switzerland, except for the furthest western portions of it, and then the what they call the South Tyrol or the Alto Adige in Italy, which is primarily German-speaking as well.
It's a fairly broad and flexible concept of natural. I would say those are quite unnatural boundaries.
Parts of Slovenia as well, too.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, and I'm not saying that's what Fichte believed, but the variations of that are what most German nationalists believed.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So he also advocated for autarky and the prohibition of trade with other nations. So for Fichte, the ethos that underpinned all of his ideas was the flourishing of human freedom. But for him, the man is more free the less he is guided by self-interest. So you see competing visions of freedom here. It's not like I misspoke when I said he de-emphasizes freedom. He de-emphasizes freedom the way that we in the United States or in England or Great Britain or in France would have understood freedom.
Well, he de-emphasizes liberalism, both in its economic and cultural aspects. That makes sense. It's at least it is at least consistent.
So the less a man is guided by self-interest, the more free he is. So that's the Germanic notion of freedom, according to Fichte, is being motivated by the duty to provide spiritual and physical welfare and the care for one's fellow man. He writes, everyone has the moral obligation to act according to his insight, but what is right can be learned and generally accepted only by means of preceding coercion. Coercion is the instrument by which the individual is changed from a being of nature into a spiritual being. The coercive state is a state which educates its citizens in preparation for a state ruled by the insight of every one of its citizens. So what he's advocating here is a semi-authoritarian national republic that manages production and distribution on behalf of the public. To him and the German folkish writers inspired by him, the German people are freedom-loving, and they lacked a concept of class stratification until one was imposed on them by Western capitalism.
Right.
And that right there is the essence of... of course, it's not true. But that is the essence of German socialism right there.
Right.
later German socialists would build on Fichte's ideas and marry them with romantic folkish nationalism and a revulsion of liberalism and capitalism. So, like, in Fichte, you could see, a germ of what becomes National Socialism. But it didn't have to, right?
Right.
Because it is essentially a vision of republicanism that is de-emphasizes capitalism. It didn't have to be a bad thing. But, let's see. Let's move on. Let's keep going in this paper. So, a lot of Republican nationalists that made the Revolution of 1848 were incredibly inspired by Fichte. But after the collapse of that revolution and the further industrialization and modernization by the Kaiserreich, there were a lot of disaffected Republicans who were dissatisfied with the materialism and perceived spiritual bankruptcy of the new Prussian-dominated Reich. So, and that's where the Sturm und Drang and Romantic movements of the 18th and 19th century were already provided a literary sort of undergirding for these political feelings that pop up later.
Yeah, it's kind of like a primordial sort of stew.
Right. Like, there's nothing organized about the Romantic movement, but in it there is a dissatisfaction with modernity that later grows legs. And so, according to Mosse, folkish thought grows out of a romantic resistance to industrialization. And this romantic resistance was just an attempt to cope with the concrete problems of modernity and the alienation felt by Germans who were reacting to the disappearance of their way of life and livelihood. So industrial modernity was a spiritual crisis rotting the soul of what would otherwise be a bucolic and egalitarian people.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. It's well, whatever. It's relatable. It's so like it's you find a lot of the English Romantic poets have a similar orientation, similar just sort of vague dissatisfaction with what's happening around them.
Right. I mean, so I make that point at the end of this paragraph that we're looking at right here is that in response to all of this, a utopian ideology of class harmony that was tied to ethnic solidarity and national rebirth begins to unfold. So, similarly in England, there's a romantic socialist movement, and I mentioned William Morris as being the best example of this. But it doesn't so much have an ethnic component.
Right.
Like, there's not an ethnic component in England, and I don't know why the ethnic component is so strong in Germany, probably because of just this disaggregated form that the German lands took previous to unification.
I don't know.
I think that what drives this German sort of ethnic chauvinism is just the desire to have a nation wherein all the German language speakers are united together and ruled in the interests of other German speakers. So it's just this proto-nationalist concept that becomes that is in essence like what drives 1848. And because 1848 never happens, and that there are Germans in all different, like there are Germans in France, there are Germans in Switzerland, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Russia, outside of the area that are ruled by, German speakers, this sort of like irredentist concept, which starts out as just being the desire to have a nation, a republic that's guided by principles of enlightenment and democracy, where all German speakers could live together or whatever, just sort of sours and morphs into like the folkish concept of the folkish nationalist concept of the nation.
Right, and the English Romantics, at least, England is already defined. It's a pretty contained.
It's got
everywhere.
It's got satisfied borders.
Right.
But don't tell the British Empire that England already had satisfied borders, because they might not agree with you.
Yeah.
But as far as the German or the English socialists were concerned, right? So the anti-capitalism of the folkish movement can best be described as ethno-nationalist small producer communitarianism. So key to notions of class harmony was racial harmony or ethnic harmony. Because using the word racial doesn't really like work, because when we think of race in the United States, we think of a very specific thing. But to Germans, it's, are you culturally German? Do you speak German? Do you eat German food? Do you listen to German music? You know, is your culture German? That's what your race is, right? It turns biological later, but at this point,
it's
that
not
we're talking
the
about
Nazi
here.
definition of race. It's pre-Nazi definition of race.
Right. Pan-Germanism is also part of all of this, as I mentioned. So this kind of anti-capitalism and ethno-nationalism becomes recognized as a type of socialism called German socialism, right?
Right.
Firmly nationalistic and egalitarian, and stress the need for an egalitarian Germanic people's community, or Volksgemeinschaft. And we get to thinkers like Paul Lagarde and Julius Langbehn, who featured prominently in the spread of reactionary anti-capitalism in the late 19th century, both of whom were concerned with the death of German spiritual life that accompanied urbanization and the egoism of bourgeois materialism.
Right.
So these two guys, I think, are like probably the earliest figures that you could say were folkish nationalists. Some of the earliest figures you could say were popular folkish nationalists. They start giving a structure to folkish nationalism. They would inspire later scholars and writers, politicians, with their ideas of folkish thought. So Paul Lagarde specifically starts out as a biblical scholar and an Orientalist who was obsessed with spirituality and what he saw as a loss of German spirituality. And he advocated for like a mixture of Christianity and Germanic paganism that he believed could be found in the spirit of the German peasantry. Now, the Nazis would advocate for something like this too.
I was about to say, like, is there a direct connection from people like Lagarde and like the what is it called? The Thule Society, the Thule Society.
The Thule Society, right?
Yeah.
Kind of. Thule Society were neo-pagans, whereas like Paul Lagarde he believed that Christianity that specifically Lutheran Christianity was Germanic and was good for German society, but he just wanted to tweak it a bit more and remove the more what he considered the Jewish elements of like compassion and turning the other cheek and, you know, self-sacrifice, you know, all those pesky Christian things that wouldn't let you be a very good nationalist.
Right.
Julius Langbehn was another one, and he was an art historian and occultist who he held similar views to Lagarde regards to liberalism, capitalism, and modernity. And Mosse refers to Lagarde as the founding figure of folkish nationalism, and Langbehn as his evangelizing prophet. So you find in their writings like this sort of typical anti-Semitism that existed at the time, which ties the Jews to banking and financial speculation, and they had a special relationship with unproductive capital.
So a Lutheran,
a Christian anti-Semitism,
Christian
because it was Catholic as well, right?
Yeah.
It's the position that they were put into by Christians, which sort of made Jews overrepresented in, you know, usurious industries like banking and speculation. And then they, of course, blamed the Jews for it.
Right.
And ignoring the fact that, like, most Jews were working class, just like, you know.
Just like everybody else.
Just like everybody else. Anyway, so, like, they started advocating for, like, a Caesar figure who would represent the folk and didn't have to be from the aristocracy. In fact, Lagarde and Langbehn both opposed the old aristocracy. They wanted to reconstitute a new aristocratic estate based off of service to the community, which you find that echoed in the Nazis, like a new aristocracy of race is what they say.
You also find that echoed in why can't I think of his name? I reference him sometimes. The optimism is cowardice guy. What's his name?
Oh, Oswald Spengler.
Yeah. But again, not in a biological sense, but in a very more ephemeral, more spiritual sense. So
Lachmann says that spirituality had been replaced with mammon worship, and he recognized that the Social Democratic Party was an advocate for the proletariat and the toiler, and he called for the nationalization of the proletariat. He thought that the Social Democratic Party should be like nationalized, quote unquote, and become a National Socialist organization. Small n, small s, National Socialist Organization that would reinvigorate the working class into the German folk. Next figure I looked at was this guy named Theodor Fritsch, who was a folkish journalist and failed politician who advocated a much more virulently anti-Semitic and nationalist version of socialism in the late 19th and early 20th century. He opposed, just like the Lagarde and Lachmann, he opposed parliamentarism and capitalism because he said that they were fractious and weakening to the national health, which I agree with.
Yeah.
But
parliamentarism and capitalism are fractious, and they weaken everything.
Yeah,
except for capitalism and parliamentarism.
Yeah. So he, like most folkish anti-capitalists, he advocated for like a corporate harmonization of the classes rather than abolition of them. And his remedy of that was a personalist dictatorship that could harness the popular sentiment to heal Germany. And like Lagarde and Lachmann, he looked back to pre-capitalist organization of his states. So he advocated for what he called a medieval social state, which prohibited usury and organized society into a system of vocational guilds. He called for a corporatist structure that would draw representatives from vocational estates that included the workers, employers, as well as employers, and replacing suffrage and party politics with a harmonizing political and economic corporative structure. So, he wanted a corporative state, which ends up being what fascists advocate and what the National Socialists advocated. It's
kind of difficult to imagine how replacing suffrage and party politics is equated with harmonization, but
it's not difficult to imagine why he would think that, because if you look at the way that parliamentary democracy works, or like look at the Senate or the House in the United States, it looks like you get a bunch of people with all the exact same class interests that hate each other like sin and are trying to destroy the other party. So I could see why it would look like that.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Yeah. So Fritsch also breaks from traditional conservatism by arguing for mass mobilization, and that's not something we really see in conservative politics until the fascists, right?
Right.
Well, I mean, I guess you sort of see it in with the reason that there is a concept of Bonapartism, right, is because of Napoleon III, and there you see a mass mobilization of conservative politics, right? Mass mobilization used in conservative politics.
Yeah.
But you don't see it used on such a large scale until the advent of fascism.
Well, and not in such a consistent way either.
Right.
So we're not talking about a moment. It's this is how we should organize life, and that's a distinction.
So these three figures that I just mentioned, they're considered some of the intellectual antecedents of the 20th century National Socialists, National Bolsheviks, Strasserites, conservative revolutionaries in Germany. I mean, that's the intellectual foundation of all of this. Now we move into what ends up being... Do you hear a baby crying?
I do.
She's scratchy right now. She's teething. She's got molars coming in, and those are particularly painful teeth to cut. So now we get into the political situation of the early 20th century. So World War I happens, and Germans are filled with nationalist fervor, and they think they're going to win the war, and then they don't. And with the collapse of the Kaiserreich and the abdication of the monarchy, comes a surge of interest in the many and varied types of German socialism. So, demobilized Freikorpskämpfer, or Free Corps fighters, right?
Right.
Formed labor associations, agricultural labor support societies, and even attempted to establish cooperative colonies in East Prussia and Mecklenburg, creating a microcosm of a Volksgemeinschaft that they wished to see.
Where is that?
Mecklenburg?
Yeah.
It's like the furthest north and eastern portion of Germany, like right up against Poland now. It's
okay.
the part that would connect to East Prussia if there was still an East Prussia.
Right.
So the Freikorpskämpfer were attracted to political extremes, right? So even though a lot of them had been on and off at war with communists from the collapse of the Kaiserreich until, the mid-20s, they were still some of them were still attracted to the radical ideas of Bolshevism. So in the words of Freiherr Manfred von Killinger of the Erhard Brigade, moderation is stupidity. No, it is worse than stupidity. It is a crime against one's folk and state.
Minus that last part, that's another one of those quotations I might want to try to appropriate. Moderation is stupidity.
So it's sort of like The Optimism is Cowardice by Oswald Spengler. Which,
I don't want to be a guy, I'm not going to wear a shirt that says Oswald Spengler on it, but I do like that notion, the optimism is cowardice.
Right. So obviously a lot of these rightists had two major objections to Marxism, which would be materialism, which in the words of Robert Waite was not congenial to the misty idealism of the Teutonic soul, and then internationalism, which offended their lofty ideas about the uniquely glorious nature of the fatherland. But men like Lenin were seen as decisive men of action whose authoritarianism, ruthlessness, and strength of will were admirable. In another paper that I wrote, I even talked about how Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg were seen as admirable figures compared to the dithering sort of vacillation of social democracy.
Yeah, Spengler thought very highly of Liebknecht.
Yeah, well, Spengler loved August Bebel.
Oh yeah, and Bebel. In a very similar way, and it also different, but depending on what some people mean by materialism and what they mean by internationalism, I kind of agree. Not the Teutonic soul part, but the ways in which there's something else that's just not quite, it's ignored and shunted aside if you have a strict materialist understanding of everything.
It's what we've always referred to as vulgar materialism.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the vulgar materialism of the Stalinist left, right?
Which is also the Trotskyist left.
Right.
And also the version of internationalism, which is kind of more like what people on the right nowadays call globalism. It's another thing I disagree with.
It's bourgeois internationalism is the kind of internationalism that we oppose, which
Yes, what Otto Bauer calls the naive cosmopolitanism of the bourgeoisie.
Right, exactly. I agree with Otto Bauer. On the national question, I'm an Otto Bauer guy. So the Marine Brigada Erhard, which is the Erhard Brigade, was a demobilized naval infantry unit that was primarily known for putting down the Bavarian Soviet Republic and the First Silesian Uprising. And they also took part in the Kapp Putsch. And many of the members of the Erhard Brigade, including Manfred von Killinger, who I quoted about about moderation, was member of the Organization Council, or actually, I think he was the leader of the Organization Council, which carried out numerous assassinations of leftists and liberals during the Weimar Republic. They're basically a terrorist or a right-wing terrorist organization. Killinger was known to refer to himself and his group as "we Bolshevists of the right." in that they were a collectivist, anti-capitalist, authoritarian fist to destroy liberalism. And to these rightists, liberalism included Marxism. Marxism was seen as a type of liberalism.
I mean, depending on like the Social Democrats, kind of were that.
Sure.
I mean, I'm not saying that Killinger is like a sympathetic guy, but it's like there's a germ of truth or there's a germ of facticity in statements like that.
Right. Facticity, is that a word?
It is. Wait, I think it is. Hang on, I better look this up to be sure. Facticity, the quality or condition of being fact.
Okay. Well, I like that word. I'm going to use it. Okay, so this loathing for bourgeois democracy, both capitalist and Marxist materialism, and an ethos of a military society, which has been described by Benito Mussolini as trenchocracy, which is a concept that many of these demobilized soldiers adopt, comes to define a new set of conservative politics. Now, there's another element to this that I didn't necessarily talk about in this paper, and that is the concept of the Oberost. The Oberost in the Baltic states was the land that was under direct control of the German military, which was a command economy that was ruled by the military, and that was what was seen as the model that they would like to see Germany transformed into. And that was under direct control of Erich Ludendorff.
Right, so that's important because this is not it helps to kind of flesh out this otherwise what's a series of abstract notions. It's actually like it's based upon something lived. It's an experience which is tangible.
So trench socialism becomes a thing, as that's probably most famously associated with Ernst Jünger. So Ernst Jünger was like a universally adored figure among the German nationalists. And he was primarily a writer, and he wrote for a number of different publications for different camps. I think he even contributed to the Nazis, even though he opposed the Nazis and didn't ever join the Nazi party. So Ernst Jünger said of this new nationalist movement, which is also called the conservative revolutionary movement, that when someone asks what new nationalism demands, one must first establish the fact that it will have absolutely nothing to do with either monarchy or conservatism or bürgerlich or middle class, bourgeois.
Yeah, man. You gotta chew on your burgers.
Bürgerlich reaction, or with the patriotism of the Wilhelmine period. So that's not really a positive political program, and that's one thing you could definitely say about the conservative revolutionaries is that they were pretty incoherent. They eschewed, on principle, a positive political program.
Right. Wait, Ernst Jünger is the guy who wrote Storm of Steel, right?
Im Stahlgewittern, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, he was kind of a significant figure, actually.
Which is a really cool book, by the way. It's definitely get one view of the type of person who was fought in World War I. I think anyone who's interested in getting inside the mind of a World War I soldier should read All Quiet on the Western Front and Storm of Steel, like back to back. Because Eric Maria Remarque talks about the just brutal and dehumanizing and psychological torment, brutal and dehumanizing conditions and psychological torment of war. And Ernst Jünger talks about the camaraderie and brotherhood and egalitarianism and glory of combat. So it's like he doesn't shy away from loss and dehumanization or anything either, but he definitely glorifies the concept of doing one's duty to their country.
Well, right. It's because it's not just the one. It's not just the other. I know it's difficult sometimes for some people, but to like conceptualize. But things can be of two natures. They can be contradictory, even.
Right, and that's certainly Ernst Jünger is a contradictory figure all throughout his entire life. Like he goes from being a a rightist collectivist to being a sort of rightist libertarian at the end of his life, and a psychonaut. He was big into psychedelics.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
I would say, when I say rightist libertarian, I don't mean like the lame, goofy libertarians that exist in the United States. He referred to himself as an anarch. He didn't have like this just slavish devotion to the free market or anything like that. But his concept of the anarch as like the individual that operated freely and without tether.
The anarch?
Yeah. Anyway, those are his later writings, like well after World War II. Yeah, he writes those, and that's not what we're dealing with here. So, right. Okay, so basically the New Nationalists or the conservative revolutionaries were part of the folkish nationalist movement, and I think that the best way to describe this phenomenon would be as an attempt to create a conservative and anti-Western modernism steeped in German idealism and folkish anti-capitalism that would mobilize the folk as a revolutionary subject in a crusade to smash cultural modernity by exercising its core tenet, liberal humanism.
It's so fascinating to think of this as like, is an actual popular series of notions. Because today, it sounds otherworldly.
Right. So another one of the conservative revolution's most important thinkers is Arthur Müller-Vandenbroek, who was a folkish writer who was among the first to give voice to the idea that conservatism no longer had anything to do with preservation and was concerned with uncovering the vital drives necessary for a cultural rebirth. To Müller-Vandenbroek, the Weimar Republic was a stillborn abomination that needed to be swept away, and the only thing that could result in a national rebirth was the creation of a German socialist state. He actually initially thought that the German Revolution was a good thing, but that it stopped short of carrying over a true revolution to a new society into just removing the Kaiser from the top of society and still carrying on the same degenerate and decadent way that the Kaiserreich was in which the Kaiserreich was operating before.
So his contention is that the German Revolution was not made permanent.
Yep, and in another paper that I wrote, I talked about how Müller-Vandenbroek was really into Hegel and saw his ideology as the synthesized version of Marxism and conservatism. And he wrote a book called Das Dritte Reich, which translates to the Third Reich. He's the one that came up with the concept of the Third Reich. He thought the Marxist left and the reactionary right were moribund and needed to be transcended by a third standpoint. So he was called the Third Standpoint Revolutionary, or, what ends up being called third positionism.
And in this case, he really does mean third.
Right.
He's really not. Whatever. He might have been functionally, effectively, more of one or the other, but the aspiration was definitely to be a third.
Right. He wanted to fuse Prussian authoritarian conservatism with the revolutionary anti-capitalist energy of Marxism. So to that end, he would organize a discussion and debate group called the Juni Club, which means the June Club, which met in Berlin and included among its members figures like Captain Beppo Römer of the Freikorps Bund Oberland, who would champion revolutionary German socialism and eventually join, as a whole, the KPD. Lieutenant Richard Scheringer, who served a prison sentence for propagandizing for the NSDAP within the Reichswehr before joining the KPD. Otto and Gregor Strasser, who would lead a left current in the NSDAP. Ernst Niekisch, whose radical German socialism and ideas of pro-Soviet foreign policy would have him inadvertently create an ideology called National Bolshevism. There are a lot more figures that I didn't mention. Ernst Jünger and Friedrich Georg Jünger and Edgar Julius Jung, a bunch of other figures on the conservative revolution were members of the Uni Club, as well as other like Ernst von Salomon, who becomes the. There are several other prominent Nazis who passed through the doors of the Uni Club as well.
You know what's fascinating to me about this is that what this demonstrates, especially the people who actually just outright join the KPD, is that there's much more of a kind of a spongy, fluid, rather than very rigid separation in the political realm. And so when people like Karl Radek are talking about trying to figure out ways to appeal to the nationalist sentiments that are operative in Germany, it's not what am I trying to say? It's not he's not just dreaming, it's right. Something real.
Sure. Like Karl Radek's attempt to tap into the nationalism that had so captivated the German working class wasn't completely out of nowhere. I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
It wasn't just, it might have been cynical, but it wasn't out of nowhere, right? And finding a way to relate to German nationalism would have been a very good idea for the German Communist Party to do, without disingenuously trying to just steal the program, some of the more nationalist parts of the Nazi Party's program, right?
Well, yeah, they did it in a very ham-fisted way.
They did it because they did it in a very cynical way. Yeah, right. No one believed them. They were like, we're just going to go with the actual nationalists, thank you.
Yeah.
And it didn't work, and it was a huge catastrophe for everyone.
Yeah, I would say that Nazis and World War, it was catastrophic.
Рабочие и крестьяне не смогут возместить нас. Без нас некому будет установить порядок, определить работу, тянуть труду. Без нас все развалится и государство распадется.